Here are some notes on Act 2, Scene 1 of A Raisin in the Sun. So I'm going to start with a little summary of this particular act and scene. It's page in our book 815 to 824. Now, if you're reading a different version of this play, the one online, there may be some things added to your play that are not in this version. So I'm giving all of the main plot points, and if there are other plot points that are in your version, you don't need to know about those. For example, there's a whole scene with their neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. There's a scene where Beneatha cuts her hair, and this version of the play does not have that. So Hansberry actually edited several versions of the play, and we're focusing in on this one from the Norton Introduction to Literature, which I know some of you still don't have yet. So here's a brief summary of 2-1. Benny is wearing the robe Asagai has brought her, and she begins to dance to the Nigerian records he bought her. Walter enters and joins in. Then George arrives, which ends their dance. Walter attempts to get into business with George. George rebuffs him with a bored expression, and then George takes Benny to the theater on a date. After they leave, Walter and Ruth begin to fight about different things, their relationship mostly, their dreams, Walter's dreams in particular, the baby that's on the way that Ruth wants to abort, his drinking. They do try to make up a little bit at the end of their conversation, but there is still a lot of emotional chaos in their relationship. At the end of this scene, Mama enters and tells them she has bought them a house in a white neighborhood, Clybourne Park, and different characters have different reactions to the house. Last slideshow, I divided it into characters, and I could have done that again, but I'm changing it up a little bit because I think this scene in particular lends itself to dividing into segments based on plot. Because, of course, we're still in the rising action. We're still discerning what's going to happen with the money and the check. And we think through this scene that we may have gotten to the climax because Mama went out and bought a house with the check, but the end of the scene suggests that we're not there because of Walter's reaction. So the beginning dance, this reflects the roots that Beneatha wishes to get back to. She talks about her African heritage a lot, and this is a time actually earlier than the civil rights movement. So Lorraine Hansberry was ahead of her time in discussing how African Americans can understand themselves and their identity. And this is one thing that Beneatha continually reflects on, is who she is. And we talked about that with all of the different forms of expression she takes, but here she's thinking about her roots. And it's a funny scene. When we see it in the movie later, it does have a sense of humor to it. Walter joins in. He imagines himself to be an African warrior, and on page 816, even though he's drunk, he's in the middle of there. He pulls his shirt open and leaps up on a table and gestures with his spear. And Walter is on the table, very far gone, his eyes pure glass sheets. He sees what we cannot, that he is a leader of his people, a great chief, and that the hour to march has come. Listen, my black brothers, he says. So the notion of the great warrior and the chief is something that certainly fits Walter's character. He wants to be a leader. He wants to be in power. His pride showcases that. And what I think the joining in the dance of the siblings showcases their idealism and their juxtaposition as characters. Not that Walter really cares about his heritage, but he loves the idea of the power and the leadership that being a black warrior could give him. Both have big dreams, and that's represented, I think, in this short plot point in the similarity of their imagination. the groundedness of Ruth, we see she just keeps looking at them with a little bit of humor and laughing, but also puzzlement in her eyes, just thinking that they've gone absolutely crazy. George Murchison enters, and we have different aspects of George Murchison's character comes in when they speak to him, when the different characters speak to him. So we start with Beneatha and George's disagreements because George walks in to take Beneatha out on a date, and she's of course not ready. She's not dressed. She's still wearing her Nigerian robe. And in the middle of 8:17, Ruth says, "You expect this boy to go out with you looking like that?" And Beneatha says, "That's up to George. If he's ashamed of his heritage." George says, "Oh, don't be so proud of yourself, Benny, just because you look eccentric." And Beneatha questions, "How can something that's natural be eccentric?" So George has no interest in looking at his heritage and roots. He is firmly cemented in the present. And then finally, we get the notion of assimilationism, because Beneatha says, even though earlier Assegai had told her she was an assimilationist, she is not. She is in the way that she dresses and perhaps wears her hair, but her intellectual manner is not. And Beneatha says, she defines an assimilationist. It means someone who is willing to give up his own culture and submerge himself completely in the dominant, and in this case, oppressive culture. So Benny, of course, here is showing off her education a little bit and being a little bit arrogant. However, she does not wish to be called an assimilationist, whereas George just, he really doesn't care. He says, later, he says, it's an 8:30 curtain. That's just Chicago. In New York, standard curtain time is 8:40. So he's now speaking to Walter, but the heritage conversation just doesn't interest him at all. Once Beneatha goes to get ready, Walter and George begin to converse. And Walter asks George if he can have a conversation with him about going into business. And he says in the middle of page 819, "Your old man is all right. I mean, he knows how to operate. I mean, he thinks big, you know what I mean? Listen, man, I got some plans that can turn this city upside down. I mean, I think like he does big. Invest big, gamble big, hell, lose big if you have to, you know what I mean?" And he says, "Me and you ought to sit down and talk sometimes, man. Man, I got me some ideas." And George says with boredom, "Yeah, sometimes we'll have to do that, Walter." And Walter understands the indifference. He's offended. Walter is looking toward George because George would have the capital and the money to help with Walter's ideas. But Walter has had lots of ideas before that haven't panned out. And so Walter makes fun of George about the college style, about his indifference. Walter says, "But they teaching you how to be a man, how to take over and run the world? No, just to talk proper and read books and wear white shoes." So there's jealousy there, of course. There's envy that George has it all. He has money, he has education, he has a father who will always back him. And George replies, "You're all whacked up with bitterness, man." That bitterness is certainly something that we see in Walter's character. Walter replies, "You happy? You contented, son of a bitch? You happy? You got it made, bitter? Man, I'm a volcano. Bitter? Here I am, a giant surrounded by ants." So this is a good quote that reflects Walter's thoughts about himself. He feels that all of these ideas and all of his pride are just about to explode from him, which sort of reflects back to his dance to be the warrior and the chief in his African heritage. Nobody's with me, he says. He's a giant surrounded by ants. Like Benny, he has a very proud and arrogant idea about himself. And this may be what's stopping him. If we can look into his character a little more, that's preventing him from moving forward. If he's the only giant and everyone else is ants, nobody's ever going to be attracted or drawn to him. So this is when George and Benita leave to go on a date. And George sort of gets in the last word by calling Walter Prometheus. And of course, without education, Walter doesn't know who Prometheus is. Prometheus defied the gods and stole fire by representing the boldness and the creativity of the gods and the spirit, but he was harshly punished as a result. And so this idea of Walter as Prometheus, as someone who has these creative, bold dreams and ideas, but who gets pushed back down into his place all the time, is certainly an interesting reflection of this character of Walter. Ruth and Walter have a brief conversation where Walter is exceedingly hurtful toward Ruth in his devastating words. At the bottom of page 820, Ruth says, "Honey, why can't you stop fighting me?" And Walter replies, "Who's fighting you? Who even cares about you?" You would think that at that point Ruth would stomp off, that she would have some horrible words to throw back at Walter. And instead, she says, "I'm sorry about this new baby." She's apologizing. She's kind, loving, gracious, peacekeeping. That's who Ruth is. Walter says, "How we gets to the place where we're scared to talk softness to each other?" Ruth, what is it gets into people ought to be close. This is page 821. And Walter says, "The way something come down between us." And Ruth says, "There ain't so much between us, Walter, not when you come to me and try to talk to me." She tries to be gentle. He's understanding that what he said was devastatingly hurtful. And they're immediately trying to have a nice conversation, trying to see the emotional chaos that has been wrought and what they can do to end it when Mama enters. And so we're on page 822. Immediately after the check arrived in the morning, Mama went to buy a house. And this segment from page 822 to the end of the scene showcases the different characters' reactions to the houses. Of course, Ruth is so happy. Ruth is ecstatic. At the top of page 823, praise God, she says, "Oh, Walter, a home, a home." She says, "When we moving?" She is so excited. Mama explains what the house is like. It's 3 bedrooms. It has a yard with a little patch of dirt where I could maybe get to grow me a few flowers and a nice big basement. She mentions where it is. It's out in Clybourne Park, which is a white neighborhood. Now, this reflects the biography of Lorraine Hansberry, and this will come into play later, the fact that it's in a white neighborhood. We know how Mama and Ruth are exceedingly happy about the house, but then what do we see at the very end of this scene? What's Walter's reply? "You run our lives like you want to," he says to his mama. "It was your money and you did what you wanted with it. So what you need for me to say it was all right for. So you butchered up a dream of mine." So therefore, for Walter, the house is a symbol of his fractured dream. From the Langston Hughes poem, his dream is still deferred. The house to Mama and Ruth, and perhaps even Travis, and perhaps Benita, we don't know yet. A symbol of hope, connection, family-centered, a unifying dream. So this house right now is a symbol of 2 opposite ideas. Okay, we're done now with this, and we'll have more notes on the next segments next week. Bye-bye.